Thank you, Ambassador Pifer, for joining us, UATV English.
Thank you for having me.
With regard to Putin and the situation in Ukraine, is the Kremlin Putin, is he trapped in his own war? What is the strategy for Putin to get out of this?
I'm not sure that Mr. Putin has a strategy for getting out of this war, and unfortunately, I think for Ukraine, you're likely to see a continuation of the Simmering Conflict in the Donbass that we've seen for the last 2 years. Certainly through the end of the year, because I suspect that Mr. Putin is waiting to see what happens in elections in France and Germany. He's hoping for changes in leadership that might lead the European Union to pursue a different policy. And I fear that what the Russians see in eastern Ukraine is a mechanism to put pressure on the government here in Kyiv to make it more difficult for that government to take on necessary reform steps to distract and destabilize the government. And there's very little evidence that I've seen in the last 2 years to suggest that Russia has any other objective in the Donbass.
You wrote that the Kremlin, they have no interest in annexing the eastern part of Ukraine where they're occupied. And so eventually they will want to come to the table and negotiate with Kyiv. When do you think that'll be, and what kind of negotiation do you see happening?
Well, ideally, Russia would move to implement the Minsk Agreements, which Vladimir Putin 2 years ago agreed to personally. Unfortunately, we haven't seen the Russians do that. But I do think there's a difference. I mean, certainly Russia moved very quickly to illegally annex Crimea. You haven't seen that in the Donbass. And my belief is that they have a different objective, that the Donbass is that mechanism by which they put pressure on the government here in Kyiv. So if that's in fact the case, they don't want a resolution. And certainly in the last 2 years, we haven't seen them move to implement the resolution that was agreed in Minsk.
You wrote that the Minsk II, it's not been followed, particularly on the Russian part, but what choices Ukraine have. So why should Ukraine, though, follow through with Minsk II if Russia won't?
Well, here's my concern, and analytically, I don't think Minsk has been implemented, and it's very hard for me to see Minsk being implemented. But if it collapses, Ukraine needs to make sure that the West sees the Russians as responsible. If Ukraine were to withdraw or somehow kill the Minsk Agreements, how do you sustain the mediation efforts, particularly of the German Chancellor, which I think have been very important? And what would be the mechanism that comes in behind that? Until Ukraine has something better than Minsk in mind for a negotiation process, it shouldn't give up on Minsk, or it should continue to try and create the situation so that when Minsk does collapse, the Russians are seen as responsible.
Do you see the Kremlin using what they've done in Ukraine, what they have in Ukraine, as leverage to influence other parts of the world, other countries around Russia?
I think it's really mainly focused on Ukraine and a Russian effort to try to keep Ukraine against the wishes of, I think, most of the Ukrainian people, but to try to keep Ukraine in a Russian sphere of influence. More broadly, though, what I worry about is if the Russians conclude this kind of tactic, what we've seen them do in Crimea and Donbass, if they conclude this works, and it works at an acceptable price, I worry that the Russians may try that elsewhere, and that could cause even deeper problems.
Okay, I know you're rushed for time, but my last question is, with regard to President Trump, he fired Steve Bannon from the National Security Council. He is comments on Syria yesterday, as the New York Times said, the weight of the world is now sinking in with him. Do you think he is turning a corner? Do you think he's realizing the role the U.S. plays and how he cannot just pull back?
I don't know that, but I hope so. I hope that now faced with the awesome responsibility that you have in the Oval Office, that his views are evolving from some of the comments he made when he was campaigning in 2016 for the presidency. And certainly I think from the perspective of the kind of American policy I'd like to see towards NATO, towards Ukraine, support for Ukraine, and towards pushing back against Russian overreach. When you look at what the Vice President has said, what the Secretary of State has said, what the Secretary of Defense has said, I think those are good signs. But I'm going to feel better when I begin to see Mr. Trump, for example, at the NATO summit in May, saying some of the same things himself. I hope his views are evolving, and we'll have to see.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Ambassador. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.